At a recent cheese making workshop, someone asked me how I get totally different kinds of cheese when I'm using the same 4 ingredients over and over again. I explained that it all comes down to simple decisions that I make that completely alter the type of cheese that I'm making. So in this video, I'll show how 5 small decisions lead to completely different types of cheese. The exact moment each decision becomes important, and I'll give you tips so you can know how to turn the same 4 ingredients into the exact type of cheese that you want to make. If this type of creativity lights you up and you want to understand these decisions at an even deeper and more intuitive level, I teach all of this inside my workshop where we make 5 different kinds of cheese and you get to see every decision as it happens in real time. It's honestly one of the fastest ways to go from following recipes to actually creating cheese. The link is below if you want to check it out. Now, to keep this simple, we're going to use the 5 stages of the cream method as our framework. In each stage, I'll show you one decision that you can make. So, cream stands for condition the milk, coagulate with rennet, express or extract the whey, assemble the curds into the cheese, and then mature the cheese. Nearly every cheese you have ever tasted was shaped by tiny decisions or forks in the road that happen within these 5 stages. Now, even before you add the culture, here's an example of one small decision that you can make, which will impact the final texture, moisture level, and even how long the cheese needs to age. And this is the fat content. If you skim the milk or use just a lower fat milk, you'll get a drier cheese that needs to age longer and will, given enough time, develop a deep flavor. But if you use whole milk or if you even add fat to the milk, you will get a softer cheese that ages more quickly. Because I'm working with milk from our cows, I rarely skim my milk. I have made cheeses from skim milk and it's been fine, but not great. I think this is mostly because I love the added flavor and rich creamy texture that comes from having the fat in the milk. One of my favorite cheeses is a fat cow cheese. Look at this. An aged cheese I created purely to see how much fat I could cram into it. The result is a cheese that is so soft and decadent and rich that it's almost spreadable. We opened one of these cheeses right before Thanksgiving, and friends, we have been burning through that fat cow. It is so good. Now, here are a couple tips. When adding extra cream, I generally use pasteurized store-bought heavy whipping cream, which is typically ultra pasteurized. Ultra pasteurized milk is a no-no when you're making cheese, but I've been using this heavy cream to boost the fat content of my milk and have had no problem. Just make sure that you add calcium chloride if you're going to be adding pasteurized cream to your fresh unprocessed milk. I don't measure my amount. I generally use maybe a teaspoon of calcium chloride to 8 gallons of milk when I'm adding 1 quart of heavy whipping cream. The other thing to keep in mind is that salt moves through water and protein, but it does not move through fat very well. So if you're adding more fat to the milk, then the salt has to work a little harder to make its way into the cheese. So it's just something to keep in mind. So the fat content is one decision point. But now here's another: how you turn your milk into the curd. The R in the cream method stands for rennet, because with aged cheeses, you gotta use rennet for elasticity and for strength. But here's the sneaky thing, and it's something that the cream method doesn't actually address, and it's this: not all cheeses require rennet. If you want to make something quick, like 2-ingredient mozzarella or paneer or cottage cheese, you can use an acid instead, like vinegar or citric acid or lemon juice. Or you can just use a fermented fresh milk, which is clabber, which is a miracle food, which I think everybody needs to know about. And then sometimes you can combine the 2 methods. Belpernol and Quark are examples of 2 cheeses that use hybrid sets, a reduced or very small amount of rennet, coupled with some culture and a longer coagulation time to help acidify the milk and develop that set that you need. Now, here's a couple things to keep in mind. Too much rennet will make a cheese rubbery. Also, fresh unprocessed milk requires less rennet than pasteurized store-bought milk. Now, the next stage of the cream method is where we express and extract the moisture or the whey from the curd. There are about a million ways to do this and variations on the theme, so I'm going to address just one small tweak to illustrate the sort of power you have right here. Let's say you've got a pot of rennet set curd. One whole hunk of curd. How are you going to get the moisture out? How you go about this one simple step results in some of the biggest differences with how the cheese will end up looking. So option 1 is that you can scoop the curds gently into a mold and let them express the moisture by just having the weight of the curds on top of each other. This is a very slow process and it locks in a lot of the moisture. So you end up getting a smooth, tender cheese, very similar to a brie or a camembert. Option 2 is you can scoop up the curds and squeeze it with your hands to express the whey in a very short amount of time for a crumblier, soft cheese like a cuajada. Or option 3, you can cut the curd and stir them gently for something like a queso fresco or a Colby. Now, once you remove the whey from the curd, the next big question is, how are you going to salt the cheese? In the cream method, this is what the A stands for. We assemble the cheese. We salt it, we press it, all that kind of happens in this assembling stage. In a lot of ways, how you salt the cheese determines whether or not your cheese is going to end up crumbly and sharp or elastic and melty. So here you have a choice. You can salt the curd before pressing by milling the salt in with the curd as we do with a cheddar or a jack. When you do this, the pH drop slows dramatically. The curds firm up, the moisture gets pushed out, and you end up with a drier, sturdier wheel that can age longer and develop those complex, rich flavors. On the other hand, if you decide to brine the cheese, meaning you take the wheel of cheese and you submerge it in a saturated salt brine after pressing, the pH will continue to drop while the cheese is still pressing. And that extra bit of acid development results in a texture that's softer and more elastic. This is how you get cheeses like Toscano and Asiago and Manchego, and now I sound like an Italiana. So one of the fastest ways to turn a single recipe into 2 completely different cheeses is to simply switch the salting method. It's a tiny pivot that completely changes the outcome. So experiment with it. Once you've decided how to salt your cheese, the next big decision you need to make is what kind of life you want it to have as it ages. And this is the final stage of the cream method. The M stands for maturing. And within the stage, as within the others, you have hundreds of choices. You can tweak temperature and humidity and length of time, but to keep this simple, we're going to narrow it down to one fork in the road. Let's say you're going to go with a natural rind cheese. Are you going to dry brush it? Or are you going to wash it? With a brushed rind, you set the cheese in the cave, flip it every few days, and let the natural molds develop. Then about once a week or so, you brush off the surface growth. This is why we call it dry brushing. Over time, the rind dries slowly, the interior firms up, and the flavor deepens. This is how I age cheeses like Toscano and Tom and Havarti and Parmesan and Gruyere and all kinds. A washed rind is more hands-on. Instead of waiting for whatever mold wants to show up, you decide what's allowed to grow there. Or at least you try to, and then you try to control the growth. The simplest way to do this is by washing the cheese with a light salt brine, 1 cup of water with 1 tablespoon of salt. Just rub that mixture over the cheese every day, flip it, and that should keep the mold growth at bay. But you can build more interesting washes too. One of my favorites is a mix of water and homemade mead, Italian dried spices, salt, pinch of bee linens. I use this brine to wash my Lady Zellas. It smells amazing. And after a month, the rind is pretty well established. It is rosy and tacky, sticky, pink. It's gorgeous. Smells amazing. At that point, I usually stop washing it with the brine and switch to dry brushing to keep the mold growth off. One thing to keep in mind is that if you're doing a natural rind, make sure the wheel has a very smooth surface. If there are fissures or cracks in the rind, unwanted molds can creep into the interior paste and damage your cheese. So those are 5 crossroads where you make a small decision that has a huge impact. Fat content, acid versus rennet coagulation, the method you choose for expressing the whey, how and when you add the salt, and whether or not you do a dry brush or a washed rind cheese. Each decision will send your cheese in a completely different direction, even though the ingredient list stays the same. I'm telling you guys, it's magic. And once you're able to identify those pivot points, you begin to make informed choices and make better cheese. One way to approach these decisions is to take a single pot of milk and use it to make as many cheeses as possible, as we do in the workshop. Or you can take a single recipe and tweak it over and over again to see how many different kinds of cheeses you can make from that. That's exactly what I did. I took one recipe and I ended up with 9 different cheeses. Some were great, some were not great, but all of them were informative. So check that out next, and happy milk slinging.